How many did we lose this time? I asked coldly. 4, Harmy answered. 2 dead, 2 captured. I let out a sigh as I stared out over the field that the enemy stood in. Their smug eyes peered back at me from over their shields, their spear tips glinting in the sunlight. It was obvious that this group wasn't going to follow us either. If we had been able to get them in the trees, we would have been able to disrupt their lines and force our way through their formation. Whoever is leading them must have figured out our intentions, though. Did they lose any this time? I asked. Yeah, he replied tersely. Got a couple of lucky blows in, managed to kill 2 of the bastards. Harmy crossed his arms and spat on the ground. He's much less pleased with our situation than I am. Despite growing up together and being close friends, Harmy and I are polar opposites. I'm an artist, he's a warrior. I write poetry, tenderly carve statues, and try desperately to capture the beauty that I see in the world with paint. He likes to hit people with great amounts of force. If it weren't for the sake of tradition, he would likely be leading this defensive campaign. It isn't as if I would mind. I'd much rather be at home sweating over a block of rock. Unfortunately, I am the son of a great chief, and with that comes duty and responsibility. Irksome, surely, but it is what it is. I don't suppose we've managed to track down any high-level mages? No. What about the— Archers didn't have many arrows, Harmy interrupted. They're out. Fletchers are making more. Did we find stones? Yeah, threw 'em. Hit shields, not skulls. Well, I shrugged. I'm out of ideas. Me too. Any weapons we could craft that would be capable of penetrating their defensive lines would either take too long to make or be too unwieldy. Blurpus only has the one smith, who is also the Fletcher, and she's getting on in years. Internally, the darkest part of me screamed in frustration at my inability to slaughter the enemy, cursing the vast open fields of Blurpus that I used to love playing in as a child. Externally, I sighed again. 10th time, I guess, I said after a moment. Yeah, but at least they aren't advancing much, Harmy replied. I looked at him, then back to the drow. Despite my mask of apathy, Harmy could tell how bothered I am by all this. We have had to fall back 10 times, and the only thing that has been interrupting the enemy's advance is the damned terrain. They weren't falling for any of our traps or taunts either. When the bastards invaded last year, they were so incompetent that I hadn't even had to take to the field. They had practically ran straight into our axes. Now, they're being far too damned careful. The bloodthirsty drow of the past had been magically given an even temper and wouldn't put a single toe out of line. Fine. There isn't much we can do here, I shook my head. Call for a reader. A familiar sound permeated the air. It was my father's horn, but I barely recognized tone it gave. It was a tone that had never really applied to me or any group I had led before, and one that definitely shouldn't apply here. Had his trip to see Ulermach finally forced senility upon him? Harmy and I met eyes, our mouths agape in stupefaction. The hells was that? I turned toward the sound. Cavalry charge? Harmy asked. We lent the Narses to Yerna, though. How can they be back already? Nevertheless, the sound of hooves began to fill the air. I turned back to the drow, who appeared considerably less smug than they had a moment ago. From their right flank, 5 Hanarses with orcs riding them burst through the trees. I got a closer look at the riders, and my jaw dropped even further. One would expect cavalry to have a lance, hammer, or even a sword. 4 of the riders were completely unarmed, and the 5th had a hunk of wood with a ball on one end. As I was trying to figure out what the hells was happening, one of the riders lifted their hand and launched a ball of fire directly into the drow. The enemy had managed to bring their shields to bear, but the fire still got a couple of them. The rider with the stick pointed it at the drow, and an arrow made of wind blew through their ranks. Mages on Narsback, I whispered. Instead of charging directly into the drow formation like traditional cavalry would, the riders began to circle them, launching spells rapidly. The drow were spinning around wildly, trying desperate to use their shields to block the various magics that were being cast upon them. Despite my shock at the situation unfolding before me, it didn't take long for me to put 2 and 2 together. The drow formation was done for. Charge! I shouted, pulling my axe from my belt and holding it high. My orcs snapped out of their shock and began to echo my cry. We ran at the panicking drow with our weapons high, screaming our bloodthirst as we went. The monster in me will forever cherish the looks of pure terror on their face as they realized they were now too far apart from each other to prevent our assault from ripping them to shreds. The first drow I encountered raised his shield and spear, but it was useless. Without the formation to protect him, I easily brushed aside the spear and yanked his shield out of the way. My axe met his skull, splitting it and ending his life. Before he even crumpled to the ground, I was on to the next one, then the next, and the next, and the next. Drow began to drop their spears and shields and try to run, but the cavalry cut them off. One more drow lost their life before they threw their hands in the air and begged for mercy. The fight was over, and we had finally won. I shouted the order to capture them and looked at my axe. It, my arm, and a good portion of my shirt was drenched in blood. I felt my stomach twist in revulsion. The gentler part of me wanted to weep and scrub myself clean. A small fear rose within me. Will the blood on my hands stain my art? I felt raindrops patter against my skin, and I looked to the sky. I cannot weep in front of the soldiers, but the sky wept in my stead. A small, sad smile made its way onto my face at this realization. As the sky opened up, helping clean some of the blood off of me, I felt eyes settle on me. I glanced around at my orcs, and they were looking at me expectantly. Oh, right. "Victory!" I shouted, raising my axe to the mournful sky. They shouted and raised their axes as well, freeing me from their gaze. The soft thuds of a Narce's hooves came from behind me, and I turned to see Great Chief Tormund, my father. His eyes met mine with a mixture of sadness and pride. He knew of my gentle disposition and wished the best for me, but he couldn't help but be proud of how well I carried out my duties. Or maybe I'm just imagining things. "Grum, my boy." His expression changed to a grin. "I've brought a little help." "Your talent for understatement greatly exceeds any of my own talents, father," I laughed, putting on my mask. "A little help? You brought us this victory." "I can only take partial credit. The High Chief moved quickly to make this possible." He gestured to the mounted mages and laughed. "Clever bastard. Remind me to never pick a fight with Ulermak." "There are a great many reasons that we won't be doing that." I shook my head with a grin. Someone whistled, and I looked around and saw one of my orcs standing next to the freshly tied drow. He pointed at the prisoners and raised an eyebrow. "Search them for concealed weapons, then take them to camp," I shouted. "If they try to resist or run, cut them down and leave them where they lay." "You wish to remain out here?" my father asked. "These are all the mounted mages we have right now, you know." This was a good point. Everything I had discovered about the drow commander screamed of someone with a legendary case of narcissism. We had destroyed one of his units, and he had obviously worked hard on their training, so it was likely that he wouldn't take that very well. This position was going to receive a visit by many more drow. "No, actually, I don't," I sighed. "All right, everyone, pack it up. We're heading back to camp." "What do we do with the bodies?" Harmy asked as he approached. "Leave them for the forest or their comrades," I shrugged. "We don't know their burial rites." "Can't we check their pockets?" one of the soldiers asked. "No," my father said. "Not a damn one of you need the coinage badly enough to invite the ill fortune you get from robbing the dead. I pay you better than that." The soldier looked properly chastised, and my father turned back to me. "My trip was quite eventful. Let's hurry to camp so we can talk about what comes next." I nodded and gave the proper orders. The drow were tied together and had their pockets, shoes, and belts checked for anything sharp or poisonous. Half of my soldiers formed up in front of the drow, and the rest formed up behind them. I led the ones in front, and Harmy led the ones in the rear. As I gave the order to march, my father and the mounted mages formed up on either side of the drow. The rain began to soften the ground somewhat, but despite this, we managed to make good time. In my youth, I had made a name for myself by running great distances for fun. Even so, the soft terrain and water in my boots was playing hell on my feet and legs. Half a day passed before the camp was finally in sight. Fucking finally. one of the soldiers behind me muttered. Agreed. Halt, I shouted. Secure the prisoners and tend to your gear. My father rode up to me as the soldiers began to perform their tasks. He dismounted and passed his hnars off to a nearby soldier, who also took the reins for some of the mages. The rest of the mages passed their hnarses off to other soldiers. As Harmy approached us, I gestured to my command tent, and we all went inside. I breathed a sigh of relief as I took my seat and kicked off my boots to let my feet dry. My father and Harmy did the same, but the mages just stood there nervously. I massaged my sore calves as my father began telling me of his trip. I listened in awe as he explained the creation of a mage cavalry and Ulermak's idea about a magic academy. I was held up at the city gates, and these 5 caught up to me, he explained. They were sent by the Adventurers Guild to join me. The High Chief works damn quick, it seems. So, there's going to be more on the way, Great Chief? Harmy asked. So I've been led to believe, my father laughed. Ulermak's not much of a liar, so I've got no reason to doubt him. What kind of countermeasures do you think the drow will come up with? I asked. You would know better than I would, my boy. But Ulermak seems to think that this invasion has vampiric backing. Vampires? Yes, and I'm inclined to agree with him. There's too much that's fishy about what they're doing and how they're doing it. It practically screams bloodsucker involvement. I gave Harmy a doubtful look, and he shrugged in response. We don't like disagreeing with my father, but he's practically fanatical in his hatred of vampires. He has a borderline paranoid hatred of them, and it's likely that even if High Chief Ulermak completely misread the situation, my father would still firmly believe that vampires were involved simply because things haven't been going well for us. You don't believe me? My father crossed his arms sternly. Well, there's one way to find out for sure, I sighed as I pulled my still damp boots back on. I'll be back. I left my command tent and looked for the tent that the prisoners were being kept in. The rain was pouring heavier than it had been previously, and the ground had turned into an uncomfortable mud. To my horror, I found the prisoners shivering in the rain, tied to a stake in the ground. Thankfully, my soldiers weren't dumb enough to leave them unguarded, so I grabbed the nearest guard by the shoulder. What is this? I demanded. The prisoners, sir, the soldier answered with an expression of bewilderment. Why are they outdoors in this weather? I think it's 'cause we don't have somewhere to put them, sir. All that is securing them is a stake. In the mud, I whispered. Yeah, but we've got swords, sir. Swords that would let them cut their bonds if were they to overpower you. Move them to the mess tent, now. Yes, sir. The guard went to work explaining my order to the other guards, and they began to move the prisoners out of the rain. As they started to march, I noticed that one of the drow had clothing that was of a higher quality than the rest of them, and on that clothing was a small emblem on the breast. Not that one, I said, pointing at the potential commander. He's coming with me. The guards didn't argue, and after a bit of shuffling, they managed to separate him from the rest of the drow. The prisoner looked concerned, but didn't protest as I grabbed his rope and dragged him back to the command tent. All eyes immediately turned to the drow as we entered the tent. Oh, yeah, that'll do it. My father nodded his approval. I tied the prisoner to an extra chair, gestured to Harmy, then took my seat and once again removed my boots. Harmy stood next to the bound drow and crossed his arms, prepared to loosen the drow's tongue at a moment's notice. I let my feet dry as my father and Harmy began asking the prisoner some standard questions. Harmy's intimidation turned out to be unnecessary, as the drow was very forthcoming with his testimony. He confirmed his rank, told us of his patrol route and orders, and even told us what he knew of the patrol routes of the rest of the drow army. There was absolutely no hesitation until my father brought up vampires. The drow seemed perplexed by the question and denied seeing any sort of vampires or brood. The conversation didn't go much of anywhere until Harmy asked about what had happened to the orcish prisoners. The drow explained that they were being used to make a storeroom, and when asked about their health, he admitted that he hadn't seen them since they were handed over. This raised red flags, and we asked many follow-up questions that didn't have concrete answers. Finally, the interrogation was over, and Harmy took the enemy commander back to the rest of the prisoners. I don't get it, I said. I thought vampires have free will. Why would they want to turn orcs into vamps when those orcs hate drow? Vampires don't start off with free will, my father explained. Not really. For the first few years, the magical being within the vampire is somewhat enthralled by the vampiric sire that allowed it to enter the body. Sometimes the victim can override the enhanced persuasion that their sire has over them, but veteran vampires can usually tell who has this capability. At least, that's how Avas Tolroth explained it to me. My father very much enjoys name-dropping Avas Tolroth every chance he gets. Tolroth was a vampire who hunted other vampires and had been instrumental in the Drow Rebellion. As far as I can tell, he's the only vampire that my father didn't completely hate. Tolroth and my father had slain many vampire covens over the years, before Tolroth was killed by a dragon. Tolroth was known for mocking his opponents with a skillful application of Gargalesis during fights, but as it turns out, dragons are a little faster than most, and really don't appreciate being tickled. Okay, I'll admit that things are sounding suspicious. So you're thinking that the prisoners they've taken are being converted into vampires? I asked. Yes, he replied coldly. And if we don't do something to stop them, we're going to end up having to fight an army of orcish vampires. A deep frown settled over my face. Both orcs and vampires are known for being sturdy opponents. A combination of the two would definitely be hard to deal with. A suppressive feeling began to take hold in my chest. Why is it that just when things start to look up, something terrible happens to be waiting just around the corner? It didn't take long for the feasting to get underway. Gnomes, dwarves, elves, and orcs brought various things out of the tree buildings and set up stalls, which almost immediately began serving drinks and cooking food. Watching a city gather together and feast without any preparation or planning is quite the novel experience. It almost seemed practiced. Hey guys, Nick said, tearing my attention away from the various stalls popping up. I'm sorry that I wasn't honest with you earlier. You did what you had to do, right? I asked with a knowing smile. Yeah. Then there's no need for an apology. Well, I mean, I could have taken you to a side and explained what was going on. He rubbed his neck. Oh, so you've learned from this experience as well? I asked with a laugh. Even better. I had figured that there was a reason he wasn't forthcoming regarding the divine interference in our journey. Either the supposed deity had flat out told him not to be, or he didn't want people to think he was some sort of religious nut. Given that he is likely unaware of the atrocities committed by aforementioned fanatics and how they are subsequently treated, it's possible the divine interference came with a warning. Nick was still having trouble making eye contact, though. Listen, boy, Nash interrupted. I can't speak for other species, but for orcs, apologies are for victims. While it would have been nice to be in the know, I don't feel like a victim for being excluded. Do you, Yulk? Nope, I shook my head. I, for one, feel a little victimized, Renv said with a laugh. I'm not biased or anything. I wouldn't have treated you any different, even if you'd let me know I was traveling with a touched. A touched? Nick asked. Yes, someone who is touched by the gods, I explained. Or, in a more colloquial sense, someone who is touched in the head with hallucinations and delusions of grandeur. That's probably not what Renv meant, though. It definitely isn't, Renv said, raising his hands defensively. We all had a chuckle and started touring the festivities. Nick began asking about some of the local food, and Renv acted as a guide. Nash and I waited patiently for Nick and Renv to fill a platter before wandering over to a stall that was serving something that we could eat. The smell of fried meat hit my nostrils like a club, and I had to swallow my mouth's immediate reaction. Nash's stomach growled as we grabbed our own platters to fill. Once we were finished, the four of us found some refreshment and took a seat on the ground nearby. As I bit into my meal, I noticed people staring at Nick with shocked expressions. He was eating both meat and vegetables simultaneously. I chuckled as I fondly remembered my own reaction at learning of his omnivorousness. I swallowed my mouthful and took a swig of my sparkling beverage, enjoying the tingling feeling that it applied to my somewhat parched throat. Is that Yulk I see? a familiar voice asked from behind me. All four of us turned to look at the newcomer. Before us stood an elven woman with bright orange hair, blue-green eyes, and a youthful face. This youthfulness was deceitful, for while she appeared no more than 20 years old, I knew her age to be at least in the triple digits. "Elmira, how are you?" I asked with a grin. "Flummoxed," she replied with an exaggerated sigh. "I receive word that an unknown sentient species is visiting the Regent. Then our true king awakens, and finally, I run into my former student out of the blue. What a day." "I wouldn't say you ran into me out of the blue. The reason we originally came here was to have you help us determine the origin of Nick, the unknown sentient species in question." I gestured at the boy for dramatic effect. "However, King Isinerath appears to have stolen this job from you." "Oh, that's a shame." She casually turned to look at Nick and froze once she realized what she was looking at. Elmira the Eternal is extremely intelligent, but she is not without her faults. The reason she exiled herself to a tower was mostly due to her lack of social grace, which is caused directly by her lack of situational awareness. If she was reading a book in a room that was on fire, she likely wouldn't notice the fire until the book was no longer legible. It occurred to me that her lack of situational awareness would make it nearly impossible for her to accidentally notice me, which means she had lied about running into me out of the blue. She must have been looking for me, which means she had been looking forward to seeing me again. Likely because she knows me well enough to know that whatever I would need her help with would be quite intellectually stimulating. Elmira said as she leaned toward Nick. "Hi," he said, leaning away slightly. "Was that speech?" she absent-mindedly asked while studying the boy intently. "It was. Did you think that I named him Nick?" I laughed. "He can talk, walk, and fight." "He? Very well. Why does he have a platter with plants and meat?" "Because he needs to eat a mixture of both to maintain optimum health. He's an omnivore." Elmira asked several more questions about Nick, which I delightfully answered. Nick remained quiet and nervous throughout this exchange, which I found a tad confusing. I would understand if he was flustered. I'm told Elmira is quite conventionally attractive, but his reaction was more akin to a barely contained flight or fight response. "I don't think she's going to bite you, boy," Nash interrupted. "Oh, right. Yes, my apologies. Nick," Elmira said, standing straight once again. "I see you are aware that I am a vampire." "He's been briefed," I laughed. "Interestingly, in his world, all of the species of our world are detailed in legends but are considered quite fictional. Vampires as well." Elmira's eyes brightened, but before we could begin discussing the implications of this, Regent Oakmore approached us. He had run off earlier, presumably to inform people of the feast, and was now looking a tad tired. "There you are," he grinned. "I hope you're enjoying Bolasir's hospitality?" "Yes, sir," Nash replied. "Excellent." The Regent knelt next to us. "Now, from my understanding, the original purpose of your visit was to deliver the missive from High Chief Ulermak, and to investigate Nick, yes?" "Quite so, Your Majesty," I said. "Having accomplished these tasks, have you put any thought into when you're going back?" "Not yet, sire, but we were asked to return as soon as we can." "As soon as you can? Wonderful!" Oakmore clapped his hands and stood. "The crux of your business here has been concluded, so allow me to brief you on a situation that's developing. To the north, there is a university. Within the walls of this university, there are several professors and students who have been studying High Draken. I have sent word to them that their services are needed here, because I am the only one who can speak High Draken, aside from Nick, of course." We all nodded, and a cursory glance around told me that Nick and I were the only ones who were able to predict what Oakmore's thinking. Nick's face was carefully neutral, which almost made me grin. "How far away is this university, sir?" Nick asked. "About 3 weeks by cart." Oakmore's grin widened. "Which brings me to our problem. I will be quite busy ensuring a proper transition of power between myself and King Isinerath, and won't have much time to act as his translator. As such, Nick, I formally request that you remain in Bolasir to help me translate until the translators from the university arrive." A period of awkward silence followed. You want us to stay here for 3 weeks? Nick finally asked. Well, just you, but I assume you're a package deal. Of course, you'll be paid for your services. We can count your brothers as your staff and whoever else you'd like as an aide, he said, eyeing Renv. You'll be paying them out of your pocket, though. How much? 1 gold per day. Nash let out a low whistle, which ended abruptly as we turned to stare at him. Nick then gave me a look as if asking for guidance. I took a moment to think it out. Our original goal was to get Oakmore to send reinforcements to Ulermak, which are either on their way or soon to be so. We also woke the High Dragon and received his aid in determining what to do next. While I do want to get on with the next leg of our journey, 1 gold per day for a minimum of 3 weeks is 21 gold, which is not a paltry sum even when split among 4 people. There is the matter of Imlor, but even if he joins us, we'll still be making quite a bit of money. It would also help ensure that his business stays afloat, and he doesn't have to travel again once we get back to Kirkana. This is likely also part of the path that Nick's dream visitor put us on. Unable to think of a good reason to decline, I gave Nick a small nod. Would 2 gold be too much to ask, Your Majesty? Nick asked with a buttery tone. Heads turned toward Nick so quickly that I swear I heard Nash's neck crack. The regent laughed heartily and replied, It would, but I can do 1 gold and 50 silver per day, but only because I enjoy your company. Thank you, Your Majesty, Nick said with a bow of his head. It is my honor to serve. I'm sure, Oakmore chuckled once more. The discussion was concluded by a massive gust of wind, the sound of titanic wings flapping, and a ground-shuddering thud. King Icinerath had returned, and was standing tall upon the hill on which he had been slumbering for centuries. The sunset caused his white scales to glimmer with shades of purple, orange, and pink. One couldn't help but be transfixed. The mighty dragon looked around until he spotted Oakmore, and growled something in High Draken. The regent gave us a nod and quickly strode over to the king. He looks much bigger now that he's awake, doesn't he? Olmyra asked with wonder in her voice. That he bloody does, Renv said quietly. Hello, everyone, Imlor said as he strolled up. I guess the unloaders weren't full of it after all. Hi, Imlor, Nick said with a wave. Got something to ask you. You do? Nick's explanation brought Imlor up to speed on what had happened with the dragon, including his dream about the god. The gnome's mouth didn't close until Nick mentioned the regent's offer. 1.5 gold per day for 3 weeks or so? Imlor asked, ignoring the uncomfortable subjects at hand. Yep, Nick replied, and even split 5 ways. Nah, Renv interjected. Split it 4 ways. I'm already pretty wealthy and happy to help where I can. Just don't tell my uncle or he'll box the ears right off my skull. You sure? Nick asked. Yeah. Doesn't feel right to take your money when I won't be giving you much in return. That's bad business, in my opinion. All right. Well, what do you think, Imlor? Will you be willing to stay here and be our ride back? It's a very generous offer, Imlor said, wringing his hands. Okay, yes. I'll send word to my family to let them know that I'm okay and why I've been delayed. Thank you, Imlor, Nick said. Imlor nodded and walked back the way he came. I really should get back to my lab, Olmyra said. Come visit me sometime, Yulk. Your mind is a precious resource that I'd love to put to use. Certainly, I smiled at her. You can bring Nick along as well if you can drag him away from the regent, she laughed as she turned and waved. See you soon. I waved back at her and turned back to my meal. The wind had blown some dirt onto it, but I'm not too picky. I brushed the dust off and took another bite. The taste remained the same, but now the crunch of the fried meat was accompanied by a somewhat gritty texture. Still better than unseasoned road jerky, though. Nick, I want you to know that I don't share Renv's altruism, Nash said with a malicious grin. I'll happily take your coin. I know, Nash, Nick sighed.